So this is the restaurant industry looking really radically different, transformed by technology. It does not look like what we think of when we think restaurant. Okay, in this situation, how do we rein in our new corporate overlords before platformization destroys every stable job, including professor? Just to be super clear here, any wannabe professors or actual professors, we are going to be replaced by bots. You heard it here first. They're going to train large language models on your corpus and turn it into a personalized tutor. And because Ron DeSantis is governor, it'll never talk about race, sex, slavery, capitalism, or anything bad about America. It's going to be fine-tuned to give you the Florida version of higher education, but otherwise it's Barton Seligman or something like that. Okay, so what can we do to try to rein these entities in before this stuff happens? I decided a few years ago to write a book about corporate power, and my book agent said, you know, everybody in the world has a book on antitrust, and God knows that the world does not need another one. But I'm dumb and don't listen to reason. So I read all of these books to figure out what they had gotten wrong. There's a lot of antitrust books out there. And I'm here to tell you, you can skip reading those 8 books. It can all be summarized in 2 sentences, what they all say. Concentrations of corporate power are now the norm in the United States. A 2018 study found that concentration has increased in 3/4 of domestic industries in recent decades, giving companies greater power to raise prices, squeeze suppliers, and suppress wages, and to exert outsized influence on regulators and politicians. That is basically the diagnosis of every antitrust book, is that big companies bought each other up, their industries become concentrated, and because they have a dominant market share, they underpay workers, squeeze their suppliers, charge their customers too much, and then use their ill-gotten profits to buy regulators and control politics in their favor. And that's pretty much the modal diagnosis of monopoly out there. So for me, part of the issue is, think about restaurants and how weird they look. Like, how does Toast, the app that lots of companies, restaurants use to keep track of their bills and convert, like, are they a restaurant company? Like, they're really changing the way that food gets to people, but are they in the restaurant industry? And do they count as a monopoly? Like, what exactly do they count as? That seems hard and does not lend itself very readily to that sort of simple diagnosis, is my sense. Okay, for most of the 20th century, if you imagined companies to be US Steel or US Rubber or General Motors, the way that we tried to tame 20th century corporations was to regulate their constituent markets. That is, the things that those firms were made up of. So I talked about capital, labor, supply, distribution. In the Progressive era, the Sherman Act was about regulating competition and product markets. Clayton Act also included supplier markets. In the New Deal era, the 33 and 34 Acts were about regulating capital markets and access to funding. And then labor markets through the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. So trying to get companies behave often involved regulating the markets that they drew on, capital, labor, supply, distribution, to make them behave themselves. As Mark Andreessen, egg-shaped venture capitalist, wrote several years ago, software is eating the world. I have many disagreements with Mark Andreessen, but I think he got this one completely right. That stuff that I've been saying about ICTs changing transaction costs, that's basically what he was putting his finger on, is that software is eating the world. That software has reduced transaction costs across all of these different markets in ways that really reshapes what industry looks like and what the sources of power are. But also, it is undermining our essential understanding of how the economy is organized. So the categories that we use to try to figure out corporate power and what's good and bad, that those categories really don't hold up the way that they used to, and that makes our job hard. It's not as simple as big companies dominate industries and then squeeze buyers and suppliers and so on. It's something other than that to get at this. And now we get back to my metaphor. Girl with flower. All right, any volunteers for this metaphor? You sat in front and you have a beautiful tie, by the way. Okay. Anybody else, some mushrooms kicked in yet? There are no wrong answers. Please.
Oh, I was just raising my hand to volunteer.
Yeah, what's the metaphor?
Oh, for this?
Yeah. Oh, or you said the mushrooms are kicking in for you. Yeah.
Outline of a tree with mushroom or bud-like blossoms coming out of it. And then what looks to be like a woman or a figure in the background right next to it.
Yeah.
With a mix of brightly colored, almost shapeless details added. Kind of just describing this image, but
That's
trying
okay.
to figure out the metaphor involved in it.
Fist bump. I was delegating to you the job of the fist bump.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks. Okay.
Is it just she's kind of obscured, right? So maybe it's a metaphor for what you're describing as the new economy that we live in now, right? We don't quite know how to measure it.
Oh, I like that. It's actually pretty good. So I'll give you my version. No, that's good. No, thank you. You know, I've discovered that saying this is a metaphor, even if you don't have one, people will make them up. So if you're ever stuck in class and you need a couple of minutes, say, this strikes me as a metaphor today, and just let people make stuff up. So for me, the metaphor here is we've got this really complicated sort of woman with a plant and the complicated things going on, and then the super simple primary colors, yellow, red, green, blue. To me, the color blocks, the primary color blocks are the simplified categories that we use to try to perceive the world or impose on the world. And those thick black outlines are the world we're actually encountering. So we've got some simple categories that we want to assess the world and jam the world into, but it just doesn't fit. It just does not match the world. So for me, that's the situation with our economic categories today. Like, what is a firm? What is an employee? What is an industry? What do we mean by big? What is nationality? These all seem really self-evident, like they should not require any particular explanation. They're straightforward and we all think we know what they mean. And yet some of the stuff I've been talking about, I think helps to undermine some of these categories. All right, so I'm gonna say rude things about economists. If there's any in the room, you can cover your ears. But I spent a lot of time trying to dig up clear definitions of what a firm is in economics work. And it turns out that it is not nearly as straightforward. For something as primitive as firm, you'd think that everyone agrees on the clear definition. They don't. It is shocking how rarely do people even try to define what a firm is. And most of the time, it ends up being a denotative definition rather than a connotative definition. So I'm looking for, here are the three things that if you have them, you count as a firm, and if you don't count as a firm. That's really hard to find in economics. It's more like the basic productive unit in an economy. It's like unhelpful. Like that's, I want a sort of bright line test. So one that I found that Ronald Coase says, a firm is when the decisions are under the control of an entrepreneur. It's like, ugh, not helpful. How do I count that? I want to know where the boundaries are. So this core econ textbook says economic organization in which private owners of capital goods hire and direct labor to produce goods and services for sale on markets to make a profit. That seems pretty clear, but does that mean the Instant Pot is not made by a firm? Because the people controlling the Instant Pot, they don't own the capital goods, they don't employ the labor, they don't actually do the selling, that's done by Amazon. Is TikTok now a restaurant firm? They're participating in a firm-like activity, but it doesn't seem like it's got the boundaries. This is tough. If firms don't have clear denotations, that's going to be really hard for us. What counts as an employee? All right, I am not an ethnographer, but if I were, this is what I'd want to do my dissertation on. If anybody's at the dissertation stage, a horrifying article in The Verge a couple of years ago about delivery workers in New York City. I thought home health aide was the worst job in the world, and I think I'm now going to say delivery rider in New York City. It's the first rung on the labor market. It's something you can get without an ID. If you got a smartphone and you can accept signals, you can probably sign on to a delivery app. So you'd think this is the absolute first rung to get onto the labor market. But it turns out because of competing delivery services, if you're not fast, you don't get called on again to deliver. So the expectation is the food is going to get there in 15 minutes. And the only way to do that is to have an electric bicycle. They're the only things that go fast enough. And electric bicycles cost $2,000. So to get a job at the absolute bottom rung of the labor market, you need a smartphone and a $2,000 bicycle that are very attractive to thieves with weapons who love to prey on delivery riders. There's 65,000 of these people in New York City, and many of them are individual LLCs. They are themselves a brand called Me. It's like they are themselves a firm contracting, but they are not. They are absolutely not employees of either the restaurant or the delivery company. Each one is a self-employed entrepreneur with a $2,000 bike attractive to thieves. That's different. That is a different flavor of labor market. The categories that we use, we're still using the ONET, the successor to the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, to categorize what a job is. Millions of people work as content creators, but they don't exist in the official records because they don't have content creators. Look up influencer in the Dictionary of Occupational Titles. It's not actually there. We know people are making money doing this stuff, but they don't actually fit into the categories that we have. What counts as an industry? So these are a few companies that went public a couple of years ago. Airbnb is a fake hotel. Coursera is a fake university. Olo is restaurant software. Palantir is a fake national security agency. Asana is software for collaboration. C3 is an AI company, same with Snowflake. Uber is a fake cab company. So these all seem to be doing really different stuff. But according to their IPO prospectus, they're all in prepackaged software, SIC code 7372. That doesn't seem right. How do we actually, this is going to be a nerd digression, I have to apologize, but for fellow nerds, it'll be worth it. And it's something that just drives me insane, so you have to indulge me for a minute and a half, but it'll be worth it. How do we categorize firms anyway? We want to be able to categorize them as falling into firms like healthcare or restaurants or something like that. The system that we've used for the longest time was a standard industrial classification launched during the Great Depression, categorizes establishments, not firms, so a physical place, not a business, based on their activities, the stuff that happens there, not their outputs. So imagine that your business consists of people staring at a screen and typing on a keyboard, like a software company or a university. That's the same industry category. They're both in the staring at a screen, typing on a keyboard industry. It was succeeded by the North American Industrial Classification System, or NAICS, in 1997. Also categorizes establishments, not firms, based on activities. And there have been some updates in the finance literature. Those are pretty good, but I have a few objections to them. But what we discover, and if you ever find yourself being a reviewer of an article that uses SIC data, almost everybody in business and economics uses the Wharton Research Data Services implementation of CompuStat data, which is a bunch of accounting data. If you dig into the details, and I know this is nerdy, but it's still worth it, what industry is Apple in? It was in computers up until 2012, and now it's in radio and television broadcasting and communications equipment. But if you actually look at the data, you discover that the numbers that people use take the current number, the current categorization, and backfill it to the beginning. So those researchers that are calculating industry concentration are categorizing firms according to what they are today and not according to the past. This is a problem for a company like Woolworth, which today is known as Foot Locker. I know. They are now a shoe store. They used to be a 5,000 outlet retail company. They were really big and important, but we would miss that using these data. General Electric, they just gave up and classified it as, I don't know what they are, which is an actual category. And Westinghouse, which today is known as CBS, weird, huh? They went from making locomotives and nuclear power plants to being a broadcast company. And every 2 years, their categorization changed, meaning that any classification of industries using these data are really bad and yet utterly pervasive, including in the president's executive order about industry. Okay, last thing is about nationality. This is the case of Coinbase. Coinbase is an online securities exchange for cryptocurrency. I don't know if they count as securities or not. You might reasonably ask, what industry is Coinbase in for trading? Is it a bank or a securities exchange or a financial distributor? Like, what exactly is Coinbase in? And the answer is business services not elsewhere classified, an extremely unhelpful categorization. That's also where DoorDash is, and I think one other. Where does it live? According to their IPO prospectus, it says address not applicable. As of 2020, we do not maintain a physical headquarters. So the company literally doesn't have any physical presence in the world. What? You might ask, come on, man, who the hell cares? As the president might say. The problem is that if we want to diagnose where power comes from, this makes it really hard. Like, what are the tools that we use? What are the numbers that we look to? The president's fact sheet cites that exact same number. 75% of industries have become more concentrated. All of them used, exactly these data to come up with that number. These really terrible, miserable data were used to come up with the basis of our national antitrust policy. That seems bad to me. I'm not saying there is no problem with corporate power. There's a big problem, but we don't really have the maps to understand where does the power come from and how does it get used. I want to spend the next hour and a half walking through these. Okay, there have been a bunch of proposed remedies. And I'm going to say that when I wrote the book on this topic, I came to the conclusion 2 years ago, antitrust is not going to work. I hereby think that I've really gotten that wrong. And I'm here to confess in front of everyone, like a Moscow show trial, that in fact, Lina Khan should be worshiped as a god because antitrust was a lot more powerful than I had anticipated, including Google and Amazon and Apple. and Meta or Facebook. So I was not optimistic that this is going to work. I'm now a little bit more optimistic that we might be able to wrest back a little bit of that power. Okay, that was a very psychedelic whirlwind tour of about 100 different products. So I don't know if you're feeling whipsawed or vertigo or totally confused. I will tell you some big punchlines. Technology has really reshaped the way that business has been done, that the organization of the economy is radically different from the stylized facts that we understood before. We are not organized into giant encompassing corporations anymore. We're organized in a really different format. And because of that, the sources and uses of power are really different than they were in the 20th century. But we don't yet have the right set of categories to fix the problem with that painting on the first one. We still need a better set of tools, but I'm reasonably optimistic about the current antitrust enforcement. Okay, that is the end of my prepared psychedelic remarks. I think we can put this ugliness behind us or answer some questions if people have any.
Do people have questions? Or I can come back to you.
Hi,
Aloha.
can you hear me? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I know there's a lot of clinical social workers in this room,
Yeah.
and we're in a
Uh-oh.
field that, despite always being very undervalued, is currently dealing with this corporatization and like Uberification. And so I'm just curious what advice you'd have for us in fighting back on this trend, or should we fight back on this trend?
You should totally fight back on this trend. I'm really, really unhappy with, actually some of your colleagues called this appification, and the idea of apps spreading into every crevice of reality. At first blush, you'd say, oh, therapists available on apps for cheap. That sounds great. And then you look at the nature of that, what it's like for the therapists and what it's like for it's like, oh, this is not really a great way to, it looks like it's squishing out transaction costs, but it's not. So I'm gonna say something very unlike the University of Chicago, form a union and form a worker-owned cooperative. So one of the things that I think is really, I don't normally give normative advice, but in this case, some of the most interesting responses to this sort of atomization of the labor market have been the creation of collective actors like worker-owned co-ops. One of my very favorites in California is called Allied Up, and it was started by SEIU, the Service Employees International Union. Really interesting model. It's a worker-owned co-op affiliated with the union that provides, as businesses would say, a supply chain for labor. What they mean is training and vetting and placing people into positions in healthcare. And so it operates a lot like a trades union, like the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. It's kind of like a trade union, but operates like a co-op. New York City, same for home health aides. I think that the time is right for that the technology enabled by apps means that the cost of organizing collectively is just so much lower. I mean, a group me could be the start of a co-op, basically. So I think that the cost of creating collective actors is a lot lower. And if you use that as a vehicle, you can both solve the problems of the people doing the work, but also, weirdly enough, employers don't seem to hate this. Like they too want to solve the problem of reliable, well-trained labor. And so, I don't know, but does that land right with you, or are you saying that sounds crazy? Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, form a co-op, form a union. You could do both.
Hi, so you mentioned that the current categories are really of firms are based on activities
Yeah.
rather than outcomes. Is your kind of suggestion then that they should shift to outcomes, or is there something else that you think would be better, that help make better sense of the complicated nature of firms now?
Yeah, I guess I was pointing that out. It's not because activities was wrong, but it's that people don't actually realize that's the way the categorization takes place. So when people think of industry, they think the stuff that you're buying, like the product or service that comes out at the end of that pipe, and that's what people think industry is. So when they think industry concentration, they think all of the entities that are selling steel or rubber or wood or something like that. And when you realize from the beginning, from 1939, they were classifying activities at the establishment level. That means like the General Motors finance headquarters wasn't called car industry. It would have been classified as finance. It helps clarify why we're getting a lot of these things wrong. One of the ways that scholars have tried to come up with a better industry categorization, which I sort of skimmed over, but Hoberg and Phillips, who are finance scholars, said, let's take the company's annual disclosures, pull all of the nouns out of the section of their annual report where they say, here's what we do, and then throw them into a blender and say, all right, we're going to say companies are alike to the extent that they use similar words to describe their products, and then it'll be like a cloud formation that changes over time. So like, I know, on the one hand, it's pretty cool because when they change their products, like Apple suddenly starts being more of a phone thing, but also they sell, like they have a retail store, and so they can sort of move over time, which is cool, but it's really hard to do social science if you can't come up with a category. And so if they're just moving from place to place, we want to put things in boxes. And if we can't do that, it's like everyone is unique, and that feels very hostile to social science. So, and just for diagnosing power, which is what I'm trying to figure out here, I'm not sure how much that part helps. But yeah, but it's a great question. Thank you. Kelly.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. You know, you were saying because it's so difficult to figure out size, nationality, you know, all these kind of questions you had, you sort of went through it, that it's then difficult to diagnose power, which is of course related to monopoly and and antitrust. But I guess just as you said, I'm trying to figure out power. I guess I just wanted to ask you to talk about that a bit. Like, what do you think is happening in terms of, I don't know if we call it, you know, corporate or firm power, whatever, but power in terms of, and certainly, you know, you have mentioned the implications for labor, which are hugely important, but just more broadly in terms of society and in terms of politics, right? Like the statement you had for the definition of the need for antitrust is that, you know, corporations not only have power in the marketplace, but they then have, you know, huge leverage in terms of political power, right? So just wondering if you can speak to that, those various aspects of power and what you think is happening.
Yeah, so I've come to the conclusion that big tech is really unlike big business. So our model for understanding power is big business. US Steel, they have an 80% market share. General Motors once had a 50% market share for cars in the US in the early 60s. Like that's very tangible and easy to understand. But when you think about who are the relevant companies then, it's like the Fortune 500. There were dozens of different companies that were really important, but they had to act collectively to get things done, and they weren't very good at that. And they were regionally based, and it was pretty dispersed. What's weird about the big five, the GAFAM platform companies now is it is just those five companies that are uniquely inescapable in a way that we've never seen that level of sort of centrality. And calling it concentration feels weird because every one of them is a conglomerate that does 24 different things. Do you know Google makes phones called Pixels? Like they're all doing so many different things that industry doesn't feel like the right way to think about it. But it's also clear, I wrote this sort of short piece about this, that after January 6th, big business, all the respectable big business companies said, we're not going to donate to these Republicans who voted not to certify the election anymore. And then 6 months later, they started quietly sneaking back in. But their idea of a response was, we're going to stop giving them money. And what tech companies did was close Trump's account, cut off Parler and closed it off and basically silenced the entire movement and kneecapped them. Like 4 companies were able to do far more than the rest of the Fortune 500 who threatened to withhold money. It's like, wow, that is, I don't disagree with what they did. It does feel weird that a few, 4 business executives could make decisions with like national level consequences. So it feels to me that big tech, a small number of Silicon Valley and Seattle companies, they have a unique flavor of power that doesn't map onto the way that we understood it for the 20th century. Because they are that screen that stands between us and the rest of the world, that's a level of intermediation or inescapability that nobody's had before. Oil, steel, yeah, not the same. Railroads, important, but not like I can't get food without access to this thing. I mean, think about academics in Google Scholar, which we talked about very briefly. So I am soon to be on record as thinking that Google Scholar is one of the most evil developments because every tenure case, every letter writer looks at Google Scholar to assess the person's impact on the world. It's like, are you shitting me? Like this, I mean, Google Scholar was literally created by 2 people over a weekend in Google because it was easy to do. And I think the last I checked, they had 9 employees. There's no revenue associated with it. It's completely a side hustle of this giant tech conglomerate that does not matter to them. Like it's just a thing that they do because they can. And yet in academia, it is the sun around which the planets orbit. Like people check their Google, not me, but other people check their Google Scholar profiles like compulsively. I mean, you could get an iPhone app that could tell you your Google Scholar account and how good you should feel today. I mean, it's kind of nuts how it has taken over the evaluation of the most basic aspects of scholarly quality. Like some people don't read papers, they go to Google Scholar to decide if someone's good or not. That's insane. No one knows how this algorithm works. It's completely opaque. They won't share it with us. They don't answer their phone calls. Like it's weird that this side hustle for all of academia has become this big gravitational force. So to me, that just feels is it qualitatively different from the more traditional flavors. How to understand it? Still working on it. Sorry. Maybe the next book.
You know, how these abstract, amorphous, major multinational organizations, obviously they're affecting healthcare, Google, these big ones. Google, I mean, all 5 have acquired different healthcare devices, healthcare companies, Amazon. And you talk about antitrust as kind of this new solution that well, it's not a new solution, but one that you have optimism to. But within the healthcare space, I mean, they're definitely going after financial firms that are large private equity firms that are potentially risking higher prices, potentially quality concerns. But it seems like the biggest issue that you've diagnosed, or at least the most concerning one, seems to be this precarity of employment.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing from the FTC side how a lot of the antitrust within the healthcare space would necessarily change the precarity of healthcare workers. Maybe I'm just not seeing it, but I mean, yeah, what else, what other tools can you give us or hope can you bring?
Yeah, so thankfully, a good, what's the labor board's, FLSA's labor? So the Department of Labor is reasonable, and the Labor Commission, I think, is reasonably thoughtful. The FTC and the Department of Justice are now using harms to labor as a legitimate reason to oppose mergers, and that seems really new. So if you can say this merger is going to cause wage declines or precarity in this space, that can be sufficient. If Kroger and Albertsons merge, it's going to lead to a lot of layoffs, and that's bad. So that is a bit of an antitrust concern. I think we need just radically reformed labor laws, because the ones that we've got, the Fair Labor Standards Act, is from 1938. And labor looked really different there then, and the character of jobs looked really different then. But I think your basic point is right, that antitrust is not going to fix the precarity problem. Like the idea of employment by the task or employment by the app, antitrust I don't think is going to fix that. That requires us to have I think a different societal level conversation about what do we want employment to look like. We don't have to have like app-based employment. There are civilized countries in this world that say, no, you can't do that. We're going to call them employees, and you can't vote to take that away. If they're doing work on your behalf, they count as an employee. Maybe it won't be that, but we're not stuck with the categories that we have now. We can create new. That's what happened in the Great Depression. They created new categories. So maybe that's what we're up against.
Thanks. It does seem to me that the real question is how do we design policies that embrace everyone, given that this is the world we live in? So if you have a generous earned income tax credit, the technology is going to go where it's going to go, but we can know that everyone has, that we're supporting low-income workers. And I mean, every single innovation that you mentioned, there's a negative side to it, but there's also a positive side to it depending how we measure. I was thinking of Google Scholar.
Yeah.
We just had a tenure case in another department where there was someone from a not particularly prestigious university who was up for tenure.
Was it mine?
Was that?
Sorry, that's okay.
And their Google Scholars citations were very strong. And one of the things that it did is it forced us to say, hey, this person's not in the old boy network, but they actually have been producing scholarship that by this metric is widely respected. And so it's how you use these things that is the important thing. And I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are about a lot of the technologies that you're talking about. Maybe it's that I don't particularly care for nice restaurants or something that maybe. But anyway, I'll stop babbling now.
No, that's an excellent. There's a whole cluster of questions there which I love. So for Google Scholar, in case you're wanting to boost anyone's coming up for tenure soon. So I don't know if you're familiar with Fiverr. It's an online app. You can actually buy Google Scholar citations on Fiverr. There are vendors that are selling Google Scholar sites that will go back and up your citation count. And they've actually got it so that it can be in prior years. So it's not all this year, which looks too phony. I'm not kidding about that. I got the hookup for you. So Google, it's so opaque that we can't get around that. So that person might be really good at being cited in the journal Sustainability, which publishes 17,000 articles a year. So there's ways to spoof Google Scholar if you want to. So I would not lean too heavily. I would read the work and decide if it's good and skip the Google. But it could be used for good. But I think all of these tools could be like, imagine a United States that actually had a civilized healthcare system and a safety net so that all people had access to basic things like health, income, the basic and education without having to be rich or having to have a particular employer. Like imagine we were a civilized country like say Denmark, where basics could be taken into account. The gig economy would kick ass. I mean, I would love to be able to do different jobs and be like a hunter in the morning and a fisher in the afternoon and talk philosophy at night. That would be great as long as I've got health care. The system that we've got now tying us to employers means it's in the US context, it's always going to feel precarious, but it doesn't have to be that way. That in the right institutional terroir, it could be awesome.
By the way, she does DoorDash, and she's in the Obamacare exchange. And in some ways, she's actually living in Denmark, in what you just described, in a very real way. That she has very good health coverage through the marketplace, and it's because of progressive legislation that allows that technology to employ her without her being left without health insurance. And that seems like a real win.
That sounds great. I mean, if we could be heading where the puck is going to be, which is a lot more variable employment, rather than how do we claw back the world of 1960, which is, I think, what we often want to do, that makes perfect sense. If we could take into account the current situation and coming up with policy solutions, rather than trying to get to the 1950 to 1973 golden era. I think that would be good. Yeah. Thank you so much for not falling asleep or not bursting into tears or throwing up during the talk. Really appreciate you. Thanks. Thanks.